All right, welcome everyone. We wish to thank everyone who made this event possible. In particular, we are grateful for Heather Benson, our department's administrative assistant, for all her help setting up this event. So same goes to Cheryl Lutkin of the English World Languages Department for her assistance. And we want to thank everybody at Information Services who have helped make the audio visual. Thank you for this event, both possible here, Hammond, and globally. And then thank you all for coming. We appreciate you being here. But before I introduce our speaker for today, I want to announce our next History Matters event on November 29th at 12:30, location to be determined. We will have Blood and Myth, the mythologizing of Jack the Ripper, presented by our very own Professor Jim Heisel. Joining Professor Heisel will be Scott Anger. He's professor of art at Pierce College in Washington State. And yes, there'll be Zoom for that as well, since he'll be in Washington State for that event. This is a little synopsis of what it will be. Alan Moore, in his graphic novel From Hell, had his killer state, quote, "For better or worse, the 20th century, I have delivered it." In August of 1888, Jack the Ripper began his killing spree and gripped the psyche of a nation. The grip has only gotten tighter and expanded beyond the shores of Britain in the ensuing century. Today, Jack the Ripper is more an element of myth than historical figure. We have filled in the gaps left by the Whitechapel killer and used those gaps to personify our own fears. Jack has become a figure of film and literature, a boogeyman, and the devil. How did this happen? We have chosen this killer to be the avatar of a serial murder. It has happened, it is. And if this subject interests you, you can take Professor Heisel's class next semester. It's History 492, Women and Violent Crime in Modern History, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 9:30 a.m. in Hammond. Now let's turn our attention to our speaker for today, the reason we're all here. I am pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Heather Augustyn. Professor Augustyn is a lecturer in English and World Languages Department at Purdue University Northwest. Yes, we do allow English people to speak for History Matters. She is also coordinates the Writing Center in Westville. She is author of 7 books on Jamaican music history, which she will discuss today. The most recent is her Women in Jamaican Music, published in 2020 from McFarland Press. She is a devoted fan of ska, rocksteady, and reggae music, and has been invited to lecture on Jamaican music history numerous times in Kingston, pardon me, as well as Vietnam, Spain, and throughout the United States. 2 of her books have been optioned by Sony Pictures for feature films, and she has also served as a writer for the documentary Pick It Up, Ska in the 90s by Pop Motion Pictures, which was award winner at the Newburyport Beach Film Festival. It's also available for purchase and to stream on Amazon Prime and Vimeo on demand. Check it out. She has been a guest on the Touré Show as well as numerous other podcasts. She has been a co-host and contributor to WBEZ FM, Chicago's NPR station, and she appeared twice on Smile Jamaica in Kingston, Jamaica on RJR TV, speaking about her books. Her notable interviews include DJ Kool Herc, former Jamaican Prime Ministers PJ Patterson's and Edward Sega, is that right? Yeah. And she was the last journalist to interview the late novelist Kurt Vonnegut. Augustyn received her MA in writing from DePaul University and 2 BA's degrees in English and philosophy from Bradley University. She and her husband, Ron, have 2 boys, Sid and Frank.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I am losing my voice. This happens frequently before I speak. I think it's anxiety, but I also did go to the Who concert last night, but I swear I wasn't screaming. I swear. I'm going to remove this because I do like to walk around a little bit. So forgive me if it crackles. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking today on my newest book, which I've been working on, called Brood Girls, Women in Two-Tone and One Step Beyond. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this particular book, the content of it, But then I'm going to, because it's a History Matters talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about my method and how I work, and how what I do is essentially public history and creating history material for future scholars and historians to use. So without further ado, again, and hope that this works somewhere. There we go. Okay, so for those who don't know what two-tone is, this is it's a record label. It was a label that was established in the UK in about 1979. And this era was in the early 1980s in the UK. Why it happened here, and it is but why it happened here is because of kind of the cultural and social influences that were happening in London and the surrounding suburbs at the time. So we had a lot of West Indian immigration that came to the UK post-World War II. They called this the Windrush generation. That was the name of the ship that brought a lot of West Indians over for reconstruction after World War II. Those immigrants settled in neighborhoods in London, in Coventry, in Birmingham, in order to find, the people came in order to find work. And so these neighborhoods were essentially white collar neighborhoods, and the youth in these neighborhoods were listening to the music that the immigrants brought with them, which was ska, rocksteady, dub, reggae. And the ska had come from Jamaica. It started in Jamaica in about 1959-ish to about 1964 was the height of the ska era. And ska in Jamaica was a blend of mento, which was the indigenous music, jazz, which is what Jamaicans were playing, the musicians were playing in nightclubs for American tourists, and what they were trained to play in big band orchestras, 18-piece orchestras, and American R&B, which is what they were hearing on the radio stations, on the transistor radios that they could pick up from Miami, Nashville, New Orleans. Those musics blend because the musicians are playing kind of a melange of this, and it essentially becomes ska. It has an offbeat. It's not the straight rhythm of rock and roll or blues. It's on the 1 and the 3 instead of the 2 and the 4. And that's because that came from a little bit of the mento. When that music immigrated with the West Indians to the UK, it's blending with then the music of the working class youth. So it mutates again. And that becomes two-tone because it's blending with punk. Punk becomes popular in about 1976. Sex Pistols appear on TV. They start playing, and they weren't the origin of it all, but they definitely helped to bring it to the mainstream. And so punk is taking place during this era. And that's what the youth is listening to. And then they're also picking up this dub, the reggae, the ska in house parties, shebeens. And one of those youth, Jerry Dammers, starts his own record label to play this music. He's a keyboardist. He puts together a band called the Specials, and they are essentially the ones that are kind of touted as the forebears of this movement of two-tone. So when I talk about two-tone, I am talking about the two-tone label, but I'm also talking about that whole movement. Two-tone bands that were on the label, you might be familiar with. The Specials, the ones that really were credited with being the first on the label. On the B side of that first single was The Selector. It was an instrumental song, but the lead singer was female. The Beat were signed to the two-tone label. They then eventually go and do their own label. The DIY ethic is strong because of punk. Do it yourself. Madness, they are also a very popular band during this era, and they first were on the two-tone label. You will notice of all those lineups, there's one female. The Body Snatchers then form an all-girl group And the Friday Club has 2 members that are women. The Swinging Cats has 1 woman. These bands were also on the two-tone label. But essentially, that's kind of all the women. And there were a number of other bands that were signed to the two-tone label. So in doing my research on women, because I couldn't find much on these women at all, it was hard even sometimes to find their names, let alone what happened to them or what they did. So I had to kind of cast my net a little bit wider, which I'll talk about in a moment. That's why I call my book Women in Two-Tone and One Step Beyond. That's an allusion to a song by Madness, and originally by Prince Buster, the Jamaican. So the theme in two-tone of racial unity is very, very strong. And that's because the music was music that blended the white middle-class youth with the Black West Indian immigrants. So the music and the band lineups largely reflected this in both the themes of the music and the composition of the bands themselves. So during this time, this was the Thatcher era. It was 1979 was the winter of discontent. And that after that is when Thatcher takes over. But it's a time of very high unemployment. And so the immigrants, as well as the white middle-class youth, are largely unemployed. There's a lot of discontent. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of frustration, hence punk. But these themes also come into two-tone. And the song lyrics address these issues. Nelson Mandela becomes a subject of the Special, AKA one of the bands that Jerry Dammers then leads up with other members. Song lyrics, many of the Black members of these bands, when they're performing, are spit upon. There are coins that are hurled at them. Linval Golding is actually attacked twice. He writes the song, Why? Why did you try to hurt me? And the second time he's attacked, he's slashed so hard on his throat that he ends up in the hospital for a number of days and almost dies. So this is a very violent era. The racist right-wing organizations like the National Front and the British Movement are very powerful at this time. Enoch Powell delivers his famous Rivers of Blood speech that ignites these right-wing movements. And so two-tone is responding to what's happening culturally and socially. What's interesting, though, is that, for me, looking at this, is that these themes of equality do not extend to the sexes. And so most of the bands, as you notice, were all men. And virtually all of the band's management was men. I found one that was a woman. Virtually all of the record industry is comprised of men. And therefore, the space that is created in this movement was largely just devoted to men. And what I found by talking to these women is that they weren't even afforded the space of learning the instruments like men in order to gain access to this space. It wasn't feminine to play a guitar and learn to play the bass guitar. It wasn't feminine to play the drums in the 70s and the 60s. And so they did not have the background and the musical knowledge that men did to even gain access to this space. So punk, really, one of the common themes of some of these badass women that I had the pleasure of interviewing was that they said that punk empowered them because now anyone could do it. And it's true, you did not need to know how to play your instrument. You could learn while you were doing it, while you were touring. That was the beauty of punk, one of the many areas of empowerment. Women came from a number of different backgrounds, but commonly we're seeing that they came from an arts background, fashion. So these elements begin to creep into the music as well. They came from theater backgrounds. Many of them were exposed to dub and reggae in their neighborhoods because they're living in the West Indian neighborhoods as well. And if they are not, they're going to these neighborhoods because these are where the sound system dances are. And sound systems were massive piles of speaker boxes made by cabinet makers with the bass on the bottom and the tweeter at the top. And they were massive, and they would pump out the music, and it would be a large dance in a yard. This is part of the British culture, very strong still today. And in a lot of European countries, sound system culture is very strong. Comes from Jamaica. Many women said that they saw their boyfriends do it or other bands do it, and they thought, that's not fair, I want to do that. I literally had one say that she saw the Beatles and she thought, that's not fair, I want to be that. And that's why she did it. Common experiences among women during this time is that, yes, they did definitely experience sexism in the industry. They were made, now the Belle Stars made their fashion choices by choice. One of the women, and a number of them had art backgrounds, but one of them especially had a fashion background. In fact, she had her own fashion label. But many times the record label was the one that was dressing them up. And even the Belle Stars, there's one that told me about how the record label wanted to do a photo shoot and they wanted to put a snake in the picture, which was, she said no, because it was overtly sexist. But you know, they definitely experienced sexism from the record labels, from the management, and the press was especially sexist. And this is something that I found just by looking through the archives. Now, this is something that you might not think is sexist when you look at it here on its face. Band of Hope by an all-girl group is set to rock the music world. But this is on a page in a newspaper called Mirror Woman. And if you look elsewhere on the page, we have canned salmon, how to feed the family something special for women because they're the family feeders, and a shortcut to success on how women should do their hair, written by Bill Reed. So these things they're sexist. They're not blatantly sexist, but the article itself too does have elements of sexism. And it's not just men that are writing these articles, it's women too in here. Some articles were more blatant, like the one at the top there, that's for the Modettes. Exposed to by women, threatened by men, leered at by Hell's Angels. I mean, it's salacious. And their traditional hand of friendships to 4 innocent young girls. So they were, rude boy was a thing, a rude boy. That's what they called, kind of like it came from Jamaica, it was a gangster. So that term continues in the UK, but the term girls is not used in the same way. It's used as like diminutive. It takes away the power. Common experiences among women after the bans, we find that a lot of them left because of motherhood. They had to choose. Men don't have to make that choice many times. We don't really hear about men leaving bands to take care of the kids. They also need to earn more money to take care of children. Many of these bands were pretty big. You know, they had 8 members. And if you split whatever meager money you make at a club playing, and take whatever at the door, and you split that 8 ways, it still equals nothing. So they weren't making much at all. And so a lot of times you had to provide for their family, and they left. There were expectations from family. This was not seen as something that was a reputable way to make a living. Some of them came from kind of upper class families. They were expected to do something different than be in a band. Some of them continued their music career and went on to much greater things in terms of fame, money. One became music director and did music direction on the Tears for Fears album, Songs from the Big Chair. Some others have produced for movies and television, written songs for that era as well, for that genre as well. So very, very talented women. Others pursued their college degree because they put it on hold to go play with the band. Others pursued other careers. This woman down here, Margot, who's extremely fascinating. I love talking to her. She still plays, but she's also an architect. So a lot of women went on to other careers too. There were issues of drug and alcohol addiction with many women. I think all that I know of have recovered from those that I can think of, which is good. And then also mental health issues. So some women left the industry altogether because of mental health issues, which is understandable. But these women had an influence on other women. These photos are taken during this time, in like the early 1980s. Little girls are going to shows. They're dressing up like the people that they see that look like them. They see themselves reflected. During the 80s, to dress up like the music you listen to was very, very important. It's identity. It's still done today, especially in the ska community, because it's branding oneself as a member of a community. It's identity making. So for these women, they were inspired by, these little girls were inspired by and empowered by women that now took the stage. They gave them confidence as women to see role models. It definitely inspired fashion and artistic expression. And it really just showed that there was a space for women. So now it's really not that big of a deal to see women as part of the makeup of a ska band. And it encouraged men to make space for women too, because it's not like, this is, I mean, in this community that's not, it's a very welcoming community, the ska community. It's not something that men did necessarily, I'm speaking generally here, overtly. And so I think once people were aware, they made space. And so today we have many women in ska bands. I was going to play some music, but I wasn't able, I didn't know how to embed this in there, so I won't, but I'll do that later. But these are, I would look at these songs as, go to YouTube and look up these songs if you want to hear kind of an example of it. White Mice by the Modettes is not really what I would call ska, but it has a ska flavor. And that band features prominently in this book because they performed with ska bands, and I'll talk about that in a moment about how I made my choices. Ruder Than You by the Body Snatchers is an excellent example, especially the lyrics. If you listen to the lyrics, they're very empowering. So this is how I did my research. This is how I started. So as I explained, there weren't that many women, so I had to kind of cast my net wider. So I looked at women in bands that were connected in some way to two-tone. So a member of a band maybe performed with a band that was a two-tone band, and or a band that was ska in this era. So a lot of times people say to me, oh, have you talked to so-and-so from this band? And I kind of had to keep, even though it doesn't look like this, I had to keep the circle a little bit tight because I wanted to stay in the UK in the 70s and 80s. There's one band that I didn't, and that was in Australia during this time, but it was because it was in the early 80s and it was directly inspired by two-tone. So I made a web. I usually don't do this, but I felt like I had to do this in order to kind of have a visual representation of my organization. And then I started interviewing people. And so this is, I worked in the newspaper industry for 12 years. And so I consider myself a bit of a journalist. And that's kind of my approach. There's nothing written on these women. There are very few things online. You really have to scour. So I want a primary source. I want to go right to the woman and hear the story themselves. And so that's what I did. This is just a screenshot of some of my my audio files of women, but I would try to find them on Facebook through people, through connections, ask them, can I interview you? Only one person said no, and it was just because she had left the music industry behind and didn't want to participate in anything like that anymore. Completely respectable, still super supportive, answered my questions if I had questions. So most people were really excited to finally tell their story and to have a voice. So I put together this spreadsheet, and I defeated the purpose of a spreadsheet by printing it out, because that's kind of what I do, and started keeping track of contact information, who I had interviewed. And then once I got the interview, I put it through Otter, which is this Otter. I love it. It's a transcription service, it's super cheap, and transcribed the interviews. And then I printed them out because I'm old and that's what I do. And I print things out, and then I go through it and I write in the margin what the subject matter is. I start to see things repeat over and over again, and that becomes my organization. And then, of course, I pull things out and put it in a text. So these are the bands that are represented. Some of them are super obscure, probably never heard of. Others are very popular, like the Go-Go's, Bow Wow Wow. So these are related because a member of the band sang backup on a ska song, or they originally were ska, things like that. But they're all part of this movement. There are others that I was not able to get an interview with, like Cyndi Lauper, darn, I wish, but still related. She opened the specials, and Cyndi Lauper performed together on stage in the very early days. So I'm sure that there are going to be some that I've omitted, and that's probably intentional, but it's kind of one of those choices that I had to make as an author. And I have my reasons, my method, that I've hopefully explained a little bit. Other sources, secondary sources. So this is my office at home, just a small snippet. I have like tons, the whole wall. These are all books on Jamaican music history, or Jamaica, or Jamaican culture and society, or political books, things like that, as well as books on the UK during this time. These are the books that I really used to inform this work, because these were books that were on the two-tone era. Most of them are on men, but I'm talking about punk as well, because there's crossover. Many women that were in a punk band first are now in a ska band. And so these are some of the books that inform my work. If I turn them around, you would see all my Post-its sticking out of them. So fun but tedious work. I also use magazines and newspapers from that time period. I went actually to the British Library in London and got my own library card. Best souvenir ever. And so did research there as well. And my good friend Darren Reggae helped me. He has a massive collection of these. These are in my collection, but he has a massive collection. And so he helped me by pulling his original magazines and newspapers out of the archives. These are British publications. These were huge because every week they would publish an issue of them, New Music Express, Sounds, and then Melody Maker. And those were like what every teenager and every young person got to see what was going on. They reviewed shows and musicians, but they also had want ads and help ads. And that's literally how one of the bands got together, was a ad saying Rude Girls Wanted. And so it was all women putting together their own band. I print things out. I know I'm kind of a dork like that, but this is my method and it works for me. So I make files. I print out things that I find in online archives. I print them out so that I can go through them tangibly with my pens. I'm a dork about pens, and I like to write in the margins what the content is to, like I said, help me inform my work. I spend about 80% of my time on the research and about 20% time writing. Because I think if you do your prep work, the writing kind of takes care of itself. The outline starts to appear magically before you if you are looking at the content and categorizing it like that. I also really excited about this. So this is a database called Rock's Back Pages that has all of music journalism is in this database. All of that stuff from the British Library, but all like Rolling Stone, Spin, everything. And I've drooled over this database forever. When I go down to West Lafayette, I use it, but we don't have it here. And so for years, I've been looking at this thing and trying to get access, and I just can't. So I finally wrote to them and I said, look, you've got it at Purdue West Lafayette. Can we get it here? And they called West Lafayette and made it happen. And now it's here and we're in this database. We have this database, we have access. So I've been working with the librarians here, and it is in the final phase of being available to us here. This is a big deal for people like me who geek out on this stuff, but it's like, it's a wealth of information, and now we will have access to it. So I think a lot of historians here will probably use that, who do some work in punk and pop culture and music in general, ethnomusicology. This is how I outline my chapters. I dump stuff. If any of you have used a DURL in one of your online, in your English classes, or the log and dialogue, that's the first page of it, essentially. It's when you read something and you just dump it there. So this is after I read the printouts of the things that I printed and I write on them, I dump it here. And then it helps me see things better. Things start to repeat. And I'm like, okay, I need to make sure that I include that, and I make mental notes. I'll start to type those things into my document. And then when I'm done, I'll go back and make sure I haven't missed anything. But this is just kind of my method, showing you like how the sausage is made. These are my previous works. I have them over there. None of them really prepared me for this book, except for informing that backstory that I talked about, the history of how it came to be. But this one's pretty different because all of these were largely Jamaican music history. Especially that last one, Operation Jump Up, was about 1964. It's literally about that year, and about how Jamaica tried to use ska to promote tourism and to launch ska to the world at the World Fair in New York. But this is what I'm doing now. This book is largely different, so it feels very different, and as a result, it's a lot more work. All of the interviews that I've done, I started doing them on micro cassette tape because I started my work, my history, preservation work. I started back in about 1995. Just a little bit about my backstory. I was in grad school at DePaul. I was in a class on magazine writing, decided I'm gonna write about ska because I loved it. A lot of bands were coming through Chicago at that time. And so I went to go look up research and there wasn't anything. And so that's how I started interviewing people. And it was on microcassette tape. This was pre-digital, infancy of the internet. And so I started accumulating them, interviewing Jamaicans, people that would come through Chicago, or I would call them on the phone. People would put me in touch with other people. It's a very close family. And then now I don't do that, obviously, because you can't get these things anywhere other than like eBay. They're relics. But I do my work digitally. I just record on my phone. when I do, you know, phone conversations. Sometimes I'll do a Zoom, but I still record it, so I have a digital copy of it. And what I've done is I donated all of my interviews to the Archives of African American Music and Culture. I went down to Indiana University the first week of March 2020, right before lockdown, and donated all of these. We made jokes at that time because we had no idea about how, well, if we lock down, we'll have a lot of work cut out for us, because they digitized all of these interviews. And they're now available in the Heather Augustyn collection, which sounds like ridiculous. But they have these available for future scholars and historians and anyone, the public, to use through this portal. And it also has been categorized meticulously because they're historians and it's an archive. And so there's all kinds of preservation rules that dictate how these things are categorized. So really, I'm really happy with this, because this was my original goal, because there wasn't anything out there and I thought the history should be preserved. A lot of these people have passed away that I've interviewed: Prince Buster, Laurel Aiken, I mean, members of the Scatolites that have passed away, Lloyd Brevet, Lloyd Knibb, Lester Sterling, and Lester Sterling's still with us, but a lot of members of the Scatolites, they passed away, and I kind of felt like, you know, they gave me something, a gift. They trusted me with their story. It doesn't belong to me. And so that was my original goal, was to preserve history. It was also frustrating for me because much of the history of this era exists in newspapers that have not been digitized and are literally crumbling in libraries in Kingston. I've been trying to work with them for years on digitizing those collections, but the barrier is always money, of course. And so hopefully one day those will be preserved as well. This was really exciting. So there is a woman who is featured in my book, a whole chapter. She's not a band, but she became iconic with this two-tone movement. This is the Beat Girl, what is known as the Beat Girl, and that is the illustration that the Beat, the band, the Beat, or the English Beat as it's known here in America. Her name is Bridget. Her real name, or stage name actually, is Brigitte Bond. She's a trans woman. I tell her story. It was not her choice to let the world know that she was trans during this time, 1964, in the UK. So I tell that story about how that happened. An amazing woman, extremely powerful, the things that she did to protest, like Billy Graham coming and to the UK and things like that. But her image from this newspaper that appeared in the Melody Maker was used by Hunt Emerson to become an illustration associated with the logo. So then I was able to find Hunt Emerson and have him make my new logo. So that's kind of me. And I'm kind of a dork. And this is I am self-publishing this book for a number of reasons, because the books that I have published with academic presses in the past, Rowman and Littlefield and McFarland, the books are very expensive because they do small runs and they're mainly for libraries and they're academic books. You guys know how much those cost. I don't want that to be a barrier to people getting this information and the history. So I'm self-publishing. I've done that in the past. I feel pretty good about it. Like I've kind of got it down. And so I made my own publishing company because this is a DIY ethic that persists. I'm a very DIY person. And I call it Sally Brown Publishing because that's an allusion to a Laurel Aiken song, because the lyrics to that, it's kind of like an inside joke, but Sally Brown, she don't mess around. And so whenever I do something, I'm kind of like, yeah, I'm Sally Brown. So, but that's that's kind of like a little inside joke. But so yeah, I'm super excited about that. So I've had some DIY kind of like bookmarks and pins and things made for when I do launch this book. So how far am I along in the book? I had hoped to have it done by summer, but that didn't happen because it's a good thing. It's bigger than I ever thought. I describe it like a hydra, like I cut off one head and two grow back. So every time I go to research something or find a woman, like they're like, oh, you need to talk to this person, this person. That's great. It's good. It's really, really good. But it's a big process. So I'm definitely about 2/3 done, I would say. My fall break, I spent 12 hours writing one day, 16 hours the next day. I love it. I don't mind. It doesn't feel like work. My husband could vouch for that. He's like, I'm always working on this stuff, and I'm like, it's not really working for me. It's fun. I'm geeking out. I don't play an instrument. I use my pen. So that's just kind of the way that I can contribute. It's a family. It really is a family. So, but yeah, so I'm hoping to be done this fall, and every free minute I have that's what I'm doing. So that's kind of my story. So thank you. I would love to answer any questions if anybody has any questions.
Use the mic so that everyone can hear.
If you could, yeah. So just like Body Snatchers, Ruder Than You, that would be a good one. Please keep in mind, it's the early 1980s. It's the lo-fi era. And so when you hear it, it might be like, oh, that's kind of strange. Oh my God, it grows on you. It grows on you. And it's happy music. They're not singing about necessarily happy things. I mean, some of them are, like this, the lyrics from this song are kind of a female empowerment song.
Grammarly makes communication at work one click
simpler. Watch out, that kind of thing. But a lot of the lyrics were dealing with some pretty heavy things.
You love the one you have.
And that comes from the Jamaican era as well, because the Jamaican ska music and reggae and rocksteady are dealing with some pretty heavy things. It's typically kind of like either love or sometimes just, fun things, especially like madness. But other times it's some kind of heavy issues. That's not the tone. The tone is very upbeat. The tone is very lively. The tempo is typically fast, not always, but there are horns. You cannot be sad with horns. I always say everything's better with horns. So, yeah, if we can play this, I think hopefully there won't be an ad before. I love it when they do.
But something new, we rule just and you just as well as you. Let's forget about this up to now, but take care, boys. We never show you how.
So let's do Rocksteady now. This is a cover of a Jamaican song, which was also very common in this era. A lot of two-tone bands covered the Jamaican originals, and then when they performed live, they would have sometimes Jamaican musicians play with them. There's a special Enrique Rodriguez that plays with them, trombonist. The beat have saxophone. And then some of the members of the band had West Indian origins. Or they would tour with the original Jamaicans. What do I think of the resurgence in the two-tone sounds of the newer female bands like Bite Me Bambi or Half Past Two? I mean, I love it. This is what these bands, this is what these women did. They created space. And I think they're fantastic. I love these bands. There's the Blues Girl Review, which is one of my favorites. It's women from a number of other bands that are musicians in their own right. Like that's their career. And they come together in Review, and they performed last year at a big festival called Supernova, and they've since been performing around. They're fantastic. So it's, but I love, the two-tone sound. I think is what this person is focusing in on. The sound too is that there's there's just something about that era of ska, because then ska when it came to America did something different. It blended with their own, sound techniques, and their other forms of music, post-grunge. And so I think that two-tone sound, it is getting a resurgence because it's things that are lightweight now. It is positive, new things that are positive. Ska is always in the culture. It's going to be strong. So I think it's, in some ways, we need two-tone and we need ska right now. We need to be uplifted.
I have a question. I really appreciate how you laid out your research, particularly from the very first sketchings of the bubbles and that's really great. I like that you showed how, visually you showed how this is your primary sources. These are your secondary sources. And I think
who is this?
It's something that we learn over time how to do research. It takes a long time to really find your way, right? So my question is sort of like, twofold, I guess. One, how long did it take you to find your way?
Moderate to severe eczema still disrupts my skin. Despite treatment, it disrupts my skin with itch. It disrupts my skin with rash. But now I can disrupt eczema with Rinvoq.
Do you have a system where you
topical or
have
injection.
legal
It's
releases, all those
once a day that's effective without topical
organized?
steroids.
Great question.
Many taking
Okay, good.
Rinvoq saw clear or almost clear
So,
skin, while some
about
saw
finding
up
my
to
way and finding my
100%
process
clear
first.
skin.
I
Plus, they
had
felt fast
the
itch
great
relief,
pleasure of
some
doing
as early
debate
as
when I
2
was
days.
in
That's
high school. I was
Rinvoq
in speech and
Rinvoq
debate.
can lower your ability to fight
And
infections,
I
including TB, serious
began
infections and blood clots,
developing
some
my
fatal,
skill there.
cancers, including lymphoma
I
and skin
did an
cancer,
event
death,
called
heart attack,
Extemporaneous
stroke, and
Speaking,
tears in the stomach or
where we
intestines
literally had
occur.
30
People
minutes
50 and
to
older with at
take
least one heart
a
disease
current
risk
event
factor have
topic,
higher
a question,
risks. Don't take if
prepare
allergic to
a
Rinvoq.
7-minute speech, memorize it, and then deliver it. And so I loved it. It just, I don't know, there was something about it was extremely difficult. And I really loved that challenge. And it trained me to always do that. It trained me to go to files, pull out the articles. This was pre-internet. This was late 80s. We cut articles every day and filed them. And so I would look at these articles and begin to form an outline, and then an intro and a conclusion, and then deliver the speech. And I became really good at that. And that just, I think I made neurons or something. So that's how it happened, was that became something that I did over and over again. That's what a composition is. That's what an essay is. So that method of constructing the outline and using evidence and things like that, that's what this is. It's identical. So it happened during those years. When I went to Bradley, I went on a scholarship to be on the speech team and kept doing it there. So it was the same thing. And then as a journalist for newspapers, that's when the interviewing comes in. That's when the primary source comes in. So I started interviewing people and became very comfortable with that. I don't really think twice about just picking up the phone and being like, hi, my name's Heather, or now usually it's a Facebook message. And so I just introduce myself, say who I am, and I say, I would love to hear your story. I think it's important for people to hear your story. And it's really important for me to connect with people, so it's nothing that I've ever looked at like, I want to get all of this. And, it's more of like, I just love to hear people's stories. And I feel like I'm the conduit through which that happens. But I have no anxiety about calling people or interviewing people just because that's what I did for 12 years with the newspaper. I get that it causes anxiety. So it's always strange when I encourage some of my students to get a primary source for something they're working on, or especially like the experiential learning project in 105. It seems strange when I say, well, just call them, they're like petrified. I get that. I do. But to me, like, that's such a rich source of information that I really am trying to encourage my students to look at primary sources as an option for all of their writing and all of their work.
Hello, can anybody hear me?
Question wasn't there? Was there a second question? No.
Can anybody hear me?
Yeah.
Heather, good presentation.
Thank you.
This is really helpful. It really is.
Who's speaking, please?
This is Lyndon.
Lyndon, how are you? Lyndon's a good friend of mine in California. Thank you.
Not bad. Not bad. I said I decided to jump in on this when I started posting on Facebook.
Oh, nice. I'm so glad you joined.
But this is very, very, very good. I see this. You've been on this journey for a minute.
Yeah, I have. Oh, I'm so glad you joined. I'm touched. I told you,
not a problem.
We are a family. Yep. Thank you.
All right.
I just have a comment. I love hearing your story and your process, but I also love hearing the history of that Jamaican music going over to the UK and how it evolved there,
right?
How it evolved over here in the US. And, I think we have policy students here, but, thinking about the policies that you have the immigrants that went over to the US. And so, I love hearing the journey and the history of the music. And I want to hear some ska. Like, oh my God, I'm going to go turn on some ska. Right. And
so let me give you something for your Spotify list. The Scatolites from Jamaica. That's the stuff to really listen to from the Jamaican era. I would recommend. There's so many others, Stranger Cole and, Prince Buster and Laura Lake and all that. But the Scatolites are really the band that they were studio musicians before they formed their own band. They were the ones that backed up Bob Marley. And when he was playing ska, because yes, Bob Marley was ska before he was reggae, because reggae would not exist without ska. And maybe Bob Marley would not exist without ska. I don't know, but I think that argument could definitely be made. So the Scatolites, check them out. Go to the old stuff, the old Scatolites, 1964. For this era, the Body Snatchers, they're good. And then, the male bands are good too. The Specials are really the seminal band, and that's not, without reason. The Beat, they're one of my favorites. I love them because they're not just playing the major chords, they're also playing some minor chords. So there's really some interesting things happening there. And then for what they call third wave, I don't like to use those terms waves because it was always happening. But for the American ska, I would recommend the Toasters. They're one of my absolute favorites. But you get so many different things going on. Fishbone is doing ska funk. They're amazing. Yeah. Oh, they're good. Yeah. And in the early 80s, ska funk. Yeah. Yep. Party at Ground Zero. Check that one out. Just the intro to Party at Ground Zero is amazing. Yep. I can put together a whole list for you, but yeah, there's a good start. Yeah. Thanks. All right, was that the sound of the sound of the music link is overriding the discussion. Was there something happening? Oh, thank you. Cool. Any more questions? Who here has not heard of ska before today?
Not us. We just wanted to say hi. We met you at the Toaster Show.
Oh my goodness. Hello.
This is Kelly and Ben.
Yeah. Hey guys. Hey.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are you going to have a recording of your speaking online?
Yes,
well?
I will. Mary Beth has been kind enough to do that. Yes,
awesome.
I will. I'll post that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
And this is what happens. People meet at shows. It's like a family. And this is what happened. This was my gateway. I went to a Toaster show with my brother in 1994. And remember, this is right after grunge. I love grunge. Everybody like grunge, fine, whatever, Nirvana, yeah. But I go to the show and people are standing up and dancing. This had not happened before. When I went to go see U2 or REM, everybody's sitting down and then they stand up when the music comes on. Big deal, and then they do this. But this was unreal. This was crazy. Everybody was dancing like nuts. It was a diverse crowd. It was awesome. That was it for me. I was gone. And so that's why people, like, we know each other, because it's a family, it's a community, and that's what music does. happy music with horns. That's what it does. Yep. That's my uncle right there, Lewis Kennedy, by the way. Hello. Hello to my Colorado family. No. But yeah, ska is really a connector, and that was the original intent, to bring people happiness and uplift them during really difficult times. That's what happened in the UK, and that's what still happens now. You know, so if you're feeling a little low, you cannot listen to ska and still feel that way. You know, like Bob Marley says, the music, when it hits you, you feel no pain. It just completely affects you physically. Yep.
So would you say it's like a direct line to something like No Doubt in the 90s?
Not a direct line, because I mean, really what happened like in America, but that's a great question, because I mean, No Doubt was ska.
And people might know who the lead
That's
singer
Gwen Stefani
from The Voice. Isn't it The Voice?
Yep.
Yeah, so.
Yep. So that's a very West Coast ska during that time too. There was a lot of West Coast ska, like, so that's kind of like commercial, a little bit more commercial, because it's LA. Absolutely. And so there were a lot of bands that were maybe trying a couple ska songs and stuff, but then they kind of found their own voice or something like that. Even Sublime, you know, was playing with some of those rhythms. Purists get very upset when you mention those bands, but it helped to give more of a platform to that music, so that bands like the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, which are also very popular, have they're the band that's featured in one of the scenes of the movie Clueless. You know, so there was, during this time, there was like it was popular. That's why people always talk about resurgences or waves or things like that. But it really is always here. It's massive in Latin America right now. Ska is massive in Latin America. It's massive the world over. So the Supernova Ska Festival is happening next September in Virginia. And a band from Japan is coming, the Tokyo Ska Paradise Orchestra. It's like an 18-piece orchestra from Tokyo. To use the cliche, it's big in Japan, but ska does have kind of pockets all over. One of the pockets was West Coast, and that produced, No Doubt. Very different than what was happening on the East Coast. Very different what was happening in the Midwest, because America's so big. In the UK, you can drive from one side to the other in 8 hours. So it was very similar in sound, but not in America. America had pockets. Florida had its own scene. They call these things scenes, but it's really just these pockets of what's happening locally with the music. Sorry, I could talk about this all day long. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
One of the bands, the only band that I recognized from the 1980s was Bananarama, and that was also one of the bands that you couldn't interview. Is there something different about Bananarama? Because I had never heard of ska, but I heard of Bananarama.
And they clearly were not.
Oh, they were.
They were not ska, but the three women in Bananarama essentially kind of got their start, but it was they were around before by singing with a ska band called Fun Boy 3. So a band called Fun Boy 3 was comprised of 3 fun boys who were former members of the Specials. So when the Specials broke up, they splintered and they formed their own band. They were always backed up by women, some vocalists like Bananarama. And then at one point, their musicians were all women. And that was done by design, because it was a reverse of what typically happened. And those women are amazing. They are amazing. But yeah, I was not able to interview Bananarama. I tried, but they're kind of big. And but they're definitely in there. And then the Go-Go's, the same thing. The Go-Go's, the same thing. So when the Go-Go's started, and like the song Our Lips Are Sealed was originally written by one of the members of the Go-Go's, Jane Wineland, and Terry Hall, the lead singer of the Specials. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question. If Bananarama is not ska, and all these groups seem to have their specific names, what category did they fall into?
And they were just pop music.
Just pop?
Yeah, they were just pop music. And so, and that's what happens is like sometimes some of these ska bands then are, you know, they move to kind of the next flavor of the day. So some of them will break up or splinter, and they'll move to the next flavor of the day, become more commercial because, you know, there's no money in ska. So they will move to something more lucrative or maybe just a different creative idea. Some of them stayed together and continued. I mean, Madness has been around forever and they still draw tens of thousands every time they perform. When they perform, the crowd is so energetic that it literally has registered on the Richter scale. I'm not kidding. So they continue to draw, but for some of these bands, they weren't drawing much. And so they went to other genres or, you know, creatively went there as well. Yeah, good question.
I'm sorry, real quick here, Heather. This is Lyndon again. Did you, when you said the book is coming out in the fall, is it this fall or next fall?
That's a very good question, Lyndon. I'm not sure, but yeah, I mean this fall. It might be more like early winter. It might be. Yeah, thanks. I'm really pushing myself. But it's just so big. But yeah, it'll be this year, Lyndon. I promise it'll be this year. Oh, I've said that now.
And we're recording it, so it's on record.
I know.
So I have another question.
Yeah.
Do you think that if you're a fan of music of all kinds, particularly, you know, rock music and such, there's maybe a public commentary. Sometimes it's just to get a girl, you know, in the mood. But do you think that ska consistently tries to respond to its era, its age, what's going on around it? I mean, I like what you talked about, the Thatcher, you know, era and all the winter of discontent and stuff. And it tries to be uplifting, yeah. But do you think that's a consistent element?
It is a consistent element, but it's not. A lot of it was just silly. You know, a lot of ska music was just silly. And that had its purpose too. You know, I mean, and a lot of, especially like in America, a lot of the ska band, that's why ska sometimes gets a bad rap, is because that once that like novelty is worn off, then it just kind of becomes kind of like a, you know, a laughing stock in many ways. But yes, it definitely was still part of the ethos of ska overall. So like, you know, the bands like, you know, the Toasters, like they're existing, they've always been around and they're existing right at the same time alongside these silly bands, many times sharing the stage with them. But they're singing about, you know, real things like what's in history books. You know, what's not in history books. That's what those songs are about, you know, or social security or, you know, things like that. But there's, you know, there's plenty of silliness too. But there's, you know, I've written an article that you can search for online that's about ska and the Cold War and Cold War imagery, spy imagery, things like that that creep in. So I really do think it's embedded in the culture for the most part. Yeah. Those who don't really didn't last that much. Yeah. Thank you, Uncle Lewis.
Well, let's give a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks for letting me geek out for a bit.